We are recording, and let me get my screen back up one last time. You know, it's one of those things where you practice it and then all of a sudden it just doesn't work how you want it to. All right, there we go. So as I said, a couple of housekeeping things. We're going to be recording tonight's webinars. Everyone is going to receive a copy of that recording tomorrow. And we're going to have a Q&A period at the end of our presentation tonight. So as questions occur throughout Naomi's presentation, go ahead and drop those in the Q&A feed, and we'll keep track of those and get to as many as we can. I also wanted to share about our upcoming events. We have one more summer seminar in August 24th at 6:30. The topic of that seminar is geology of the Amargosa Basin. So for all of you geology heads out there, this is going to be a great topic, and that's going to be led by our board member, Bill Neal. So make sure you do register for that, and so you can catch that on the 24th. I also just want to invite everyone, if you're here for the first time, you found out about this event through social media or elsewhere, I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. It's the best way to just stay in the know about all of our events coming up. We are going to have a fall series of seminars as well. And so signing up for the newsletter is the best way to be notified about those upcoming events. I'm going to drop a link in the chat in just a few moments so you can sign up for the newsletter. And while you're there, I just really sincerely encourage you to consider donating and supporting the Amargosa Conservancy. We're a really small organization. We love putting on these events for our members, but we need your support. And tonight's presentation, I think, is a great example of why. We're a small organization with a really big job, and that job entails defending a lot of these magnificent plants that Naomi is going to teach us about. So please jump on that newsletter and consider supporting the Amargosa Conservancy today. Finally, I just wanted to give a huge shout out, a thank you to two of our donors, two of our members, Jeffrey Steinkamp and Corey Hermanson. They are our sponsors for the summer seminar series. We really appreciate them. And if you're interested in potentially sponsoring the fall series or a future series, please reach out to us at info@amargosaconservancy.org. We would love to have a conversation around what that looks like. So with no further ado, I'm now going to stop sharing my screen and introduce tonight's speaker. So tonight we are being led by Naomi Fraga. Naomi is the Director of Conservation Programs at California Botanic Garden. She received a PhD in botany from Claremont Graduate University, and she also has an MS in botany from CGU and a BS in botany as well. So she, needless to say, is an absolute expert in botanicals. She's been part of our organization since 2017 and became our treasurer in 2019. And she also serves on the board of the Southern California Botanists and the Claremont Wildlands Conservancy. So we are really, really fortunate to have Naomi here. I can say personally that as a staff member, I've benefited enormously from having Naomi around. I've had the chance to walk out in parts of the Amargosa Basin to see some of these amazing plants that she's going to teach us about. And so we're really, really fortunate to have her on our board. With no further ado, Naomi, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Mason, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I'm really happy to see all of you here, and talking about plants of the Amargosa River is one of my favorite things to do. So I hope you all enjoy. I just want to, before we dive into the rare plants, just acknowledge the essential relationship that people and plants have. Before I became a botanist, I was really naive to understanding the essential nature of plants and their role in our everyday lives, including the everyday plants, the native plants that people don't necessarily know about. But now that I have intimate knowledge of the native plants, I understand how they provide for us on an everyday basis. And so with that, I want to thank the Southern Paiute and the Dibisha who have stewarded the lands of this place where I'm so privileged to research, and their work, their knowledge, and they're just really incredible special plants in this region. And yeah, plants and people go hand in hand. So just to give you an outline of where we're going to go with this talk today, first I want to we're going to zoom out and give kind of an overview of the physical setting in the Amargosa River Basin, and sort of set up the setting that provides the opportunity for incredible diversity and plants to occur there. I'm going to talk about specific research I've been conducting in two parts. One is floristic research, which is essentially plant geography and to understand why plants occur where, and some different floristic projects that are occurring in the region. And then I'm going to dive into two specific projects that center around rare plants of the Amargosa. And that'll be about the Amargosa nightwort and the Tecopha birdspeak. This picture, by the way, is from Lower Carson Slough out near Death Valley Junction, where we monitor the Amargosa nightwort every year in July. And this was probably, I see a lot of incredible sunrises out in the Amargosa, but I have to say, this is my #1 sunrise in the Amargosa. It was 90 degrees at 5:30 a.m. but we had this incredible cloud cover. This was last July when we had incredible record-breaking heat. But there was this incredible cloud cover too that created this awesome sunrise, and it was a very memorable day out there on the slough. So in order to understand the modern day Amargosa River, we need to zoom back in time, back to the last ice age in the Pleistocene. So if we think about what the region was like 18,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, we had incredible lakes scattered across eastern California. So this was a time of increased precipitation, lots of snowfall, lots of rain at the lower elevations, creating these incredible lakes and I'm assuming incredible lush wetlands in and around those lakes. So all of this water that was falling from the sky at this time fed into a deep underground aquifer that persists to this day. And that is the water that emerges in modern day seeps and springs in the Amargosa River. So it's very ancient water, tens of thousands of years old. And so we're benefiting today from incredible precipitation of the past. And that past climate is really important to think about modern day biodiversity in this incredible region. So then when we this is a map showing the Death Valley regional groundwater flow system. So we could think about this very extensive groundwater aquifer that bubbles up at seeps and springs at different points along the Amargosa River, sometimes called the hide and seek river because it dips down below the surface and comes up in different areas. And so down in the Amargosa River Canyon, get my pointer, which is kind of in this zone here before it makes the turn towards, this is Badwater Basin in Death Valley. We have perennial flow here, and then Ash Meadows is kind of here near the state line where there's lots of water bubbling up to the surface. And so in certain areas, we have these incredible lush wetlands. This is along the river here, which is this black line. Yeah, it's just very incredible ecosystems, you know, one of the hottest, driest places in North America. And we have these incredible wetlands scattered throughout. But then when we think about modern day precipitation, it's really important to think about how that past precipitation is no more. We don't have that time of increased precipitation, and we've come into a time of drying and warming. And so this is precipitation data taken, this is data from Lower Carson Slough in the Amargosa Valley. And this dashed line here is average precipitation, which is averaged across 30 years. So I have two sets of 30-year normals here. So the older set from 1981 to 2010 says we get about 11 centimeters on average of rain a year. The newer 30-year normal has a decrease where we're more like 10 centimeters, so a drop in 1 centimeter, because as with climate change, we have now increased drying and warming. And then this blue line shows precipitation for different years. And this is follows the hydrological year, which is October to September. And you can see there's a lot of variation in precipitation annually, but that in 2021, we have one of the driest years on record where we only had about 1.1 inches of rain. And so one of the things I'll kind of hit on later is just thinking about how even though these systems, as these incredible groundwater dependent ecosystems rely on water, ancient water of the past, modern day drought is definitely impacting these ecosystems as well. And so one of the things I really strive for as a botanist, one of the things I think about often is preventing plant extinction, because I understand that plants have this essential role in our lives, no matter how small a range or how obscure the plant. All plant species on Earth are precious, and it's my goal, if I can do anything about it, that I would hope that I can help prevent extinction of all these different species. There's this really interesting paper that was published on vascular plant extinction in North America, where they went through all the records of putative extinctions in the United States, and they found they confirmed 65 documented cases of extinction in the United States. So with that comes some interesting statistics, because California, the state in which I work, has the most documented extinctions with 19 of the 65. And a lot of that is due to development. So you could just imagine that the city of Los Angeles is responsible for some of those. That's where I live. And that's one of these here is the Los Angeles sunflower, Helianthus Natoli subspecies Parishii. So habitat conversion modification is really responsible for a lot of these. And one of the things that to me is a big takeaway idea, a quote from this paper, is they say preventing extinction is the lowest bar for conservation success. And I know sometimes me and my conservation colleagues feel like we're in triage mode, just trying to prevent horrible things from happening and species from going extinct. But there's so much more we can do for ecosystems to ensure that species thrive. And obviously in modern day, development has been a serious threat to biodiversity, but in modern times, climate change is really a serious thing for us to consider. So we have these incredible groundwater dependent ecosystems in one of the driest, hottest places in North America that form these rich alkali wetlands. And so that's one of the reasons this area has attracted me as a botanist, because there's just such unique biodiversity here. In addition, I'm going to really focus on the alkali wetlands for this presentation, but there's a whole other presentation that can be done that looks at the carbonate mountain ranges and all the plants associated with calcareous rock, limestone, dolomite, marble. There's all sorts of plants restricted to those kinds of rock that occur in the Amargosa region. The Death Valley sage, some of you might be familiar with, is one of them. It's a really incredible plant. But this area is also interesting because it's a zone where the Mojave Desert meets the Great Basin Desert. And so we find really interesting plant assemblages here as well. And so I just kind of want to take you through some of the beautiful landscapes that you might see in the Amargosa region. This is the Amargosa River, south of Shoshone, but north of Tecopa. You can see Tecopa Peak right here. This is Tecopa Peak in a year where there was much more ample precipitation. This was in 2017, and you can see this field of desert gold. So the seed bank is there, and it's just waiting for the next rain year, and we might have a glorious bloom again in the future. This photo I took, I was up on a ridge in the Resting Spring Range, and this mountain range here is the Nopah Range, and down here is Chicago Valley, which has really incredible lush mesquite woodland and some playa habitat that supports a couple of rare plants, namely the Pahrump Orange and the Pahrump Valley buckwheat, which I'll talk a little bit about them in a future slide. And I just kind of want to zoom into, this is zoomed into Chicago Valley, and you could see 3 distinct habitat types here, which I think is interesting. So you have that carbonate rock, which supports all kinds of rare plants like the white-spined agave, Mortonia utahensis. I'm struggling to think of all their common names, I'm sorry. But and then there's the mesquite woodland. And then we have this playa habitat, which looks devoid of vegetation, but supports a couple of rare plants. And they're kind of when you look for them, they really blend in with the dirt. So it's actually, or soil, it's really hard to find them sometimes. And then this is just a view zooming into the Nopah Range. This is the canyon that leads up to Pahrump Peak. And there's lots of agaves in this canyon and lots of cool plants that grow on the rocks. And then, of course, we have the luscious meadows of Ash Meadows area and these incredible springs, crystal blue, and there's all sorts of wetland habitat that supports many rare plant species. And the outflow of Ash Meadows leads towards Carson Slough near Death Valley Junction. And so you can see water here on the surface. This is alkali mud. This is Eagle Mountain right here. And there's numerous rare plant species that occur out here on these mud flats, which are very fascinating. So one of the lines of research that I conduct is, we call it Floristic Research. And what it is, it's essentially plant geography, where we're documenting plant species and where they occur to understand distribution and abundance of plant species. And it really lays the foundation for understanding basic knowledge about plants. And the data that we collect are called herbarium specimens. So we physically collect plant material, we dry it, we press it, and that is the basic, and we take notes about the plant and its location and when we collected it. And I'll talk a little bit more about herbarium specimens, but that's the basic kind of data we collect. And so I will be talking about one floristic project that we've been working on, or we just completed actually in the Amargosa River. I want to note that this is one of my students. This is Carolyn Mills, and she is finishing up a floristic study in the Nopah Range. And so this is an incredibly rugged mountain range, reaches over 6,000 feet in elevation. And at the top, there's junipers. It's really incredible. And so stay tuned. You might see some information from the AC, maybe in a newsletter or an email post, maybe with some updates on what she's found. So back to the herbarium. So we collect these specimens. And this is an example of the Tecopa Birdspeak herbarium specimen. And you can see I've zoomed in on the label here, which is located here on the specimen. And it has information about the location and the date. This specimen actually happens to be the most important specimen, you might argue, for the Tecopa Birdspeak, because it's the specimen associated with the original description of when it was named. So it was described in 1950, and this collection was made in 1949 in October. Philip Munns happened to be the herbarium curator at the institution where I work today. So there's a legacy of botanical work coming from the California Botanic Garden. But we can glean a lot of information from these historical specimens, and they tell information about the habitat and what plants it was growing with. And sometimes we can understand what change has happened in the area. And maybe I might go to Tecopa Hot Springs and maybe it's not as abundant as it used to be. So he says it's common annual with these species. Happy to report that this plant is still fairly common in and around Tecopa Hot Springs, and I hope that will be the case for time to come. So this is a map of California showing all of these herbarium specimens in white. Essentially, they light up California. And so areas with black are areas that have an absence of these specimens documenting plants in a region. And so the Amargosa region in California is this area. So you can see we're lacking collections in certain areas. So this was taken in 2018. So I do hope that as Carolyn submits her specimens and I also submit my specimens, that we might fill in a lot of these gaps. You can see this line here. This is Highway 127. So a lot of collecting roadside. And so we need to really get away from the road and document these plants. So the project I would like to talk to you about, just give you a brief summary, is a floristic study we did along the Amargosa Wild and Scenic River. And so we did this in partnership with the Bureau of Land Management, we completed it just early this year. And so there are 33.8 miles designated, federally designated as wild and scenic river. And the wild and scenic river portion of the Amargosa River occurs between Shoshone, here's Tecopa, it goes through the river canyon and then comes out by Dumont Dunes out towards the highway. So our project was to conduct a botanical inventory to document all the plants, to map rare plants, invasive species, and also to create a vegetation map. And you can see here some of our mapping. All this red here, unfortunately, is salt cedar, Tamarisk ramosissima. So there is quite a bit of tamarisk along the river. So in this project area, we documented 16 plants of conservation concern. 2 of them are federally listed. We also noted several rare vegetation alliances, like 3 Square Bulrush is a rare vegetation alliance in California, but quite abundant in Tecopa. And we also noted that probably the most significant threat to biodiversity in this region really has to do with groundwater extraction, groundwater overdraft, and also climate change, because we did our surveys in 2 very dry years and definitely saw impacts to vegetation. So overall, as a part of this study, we documented over 200 or about 200 plant species and 24 vegetation alliances. And then we also produced this map of living Scrubian mesquite. So just a little bit note about this. This is a dead Scrubian mesquite. So if you're traveling through the Amargosa and looking at the wetland between Tecopa and Shoshone, unfortunately, what you'll see is a lot of standing dead trees, and those are all Scrubian mesquite. So there's been massive mortality in many parts of its range. And there's ongoing research being conducted. I know the BLM is supporting this research. But it looks like it's associated with fungal pathogens. So I'm not an expert on this particular die-off, but there is probably more information that will be forthcoming in the next couple of years. So if you're interested or concerned, I encourage you to stay tuned, and perhaps the Amargosa Conservancy will be able to distribute some of this knowledge in the future. One of the interesting things we found along the Amargosa Wild and Scenic River is that the vast majority of the species richness is composed of annual herbs. So these are species that begin and end their life cycle within the span of a single year. The majority of these would be winter annuals. So they would germinate with the winter rains in December and January and complete their life cycle, most likely by the end of April or early May, before the onset of the extreme heat. And that makes sense for a life strategy in the hot and dry Mojave Desert. And so in a lot of areas in the Mojave, you'll see that a significant proportion of the species are annuals. And so that means in dry years, you're not seeing many of the species pop up. A lot of them are dormant in the ground as seeds. And so it may seem like in some areas, maybe people think of desert areas as having less richness, but it's because many of those are dormant for many parts of the year. There's also a lot of perennial herbs, and I attribute that to the wetlands because there's lots of grasses and rushes and things of that sort. One of the annuals that lives in the Amargosa River is this plant, Oxystylus lutea. This is a really cool plant that's in bloom right now. This is an unusual annual because it blooms in the hottest months of the year. It blooms in the summertime. And just a couple of weeks ago, I saw this plant blooming all along Highway 127 through Shoshone. This is also a plant of limited distribution. It is considered a rare plant and is pretty well restricted to the Amargosa or northern Mojave Desert region. One of the rare plants we documented as a part of our surveys was the California satin tail, Imperata brevifolia. This plant has a really interesting history because back in the 1920s and 30s, this plant was the unfortunate victim of mistaken identity. There's a different species in this same genus, another Imperata, that's considered a noxious weed. And they mistook this plant for that non-native noxious weed. And there was a lot of work to try to eradicate it, except then people later learned that it was actually a native plant and they shouldn't eradicate it. And instead, now there's work to try to protect it. So that was very unfortunate, but I'm very glad that there are populations that are doing well along the Amargosa River. There's also many populations of this species in Death Valley National Park and in Ash Meadows. The species is actually fairly widespread and occurs from California all the way to New Mexico and near Texas, West Texas. But it only occurs in these desert wetlands. There's some coastal locations, but primarily it's a desert species. And so it's considered of conservation concern all across its range because these habitats are vulnerable and it doesn't occur very frequently. Another rare plant where we documented many new occurrences is the alkali salt marsh aster, Almataster Passaflorus. It's a really pretty herbaceous plant. It's probably in bloom right now. This is a photo from around Tecopa, and it's just a very lovely daisy that occurs in many of the wetlands, and also a plant of conservation concern, a rare plant of limited distribution in California. So to summarize our Amargosa River surveys, Wild and Scenic River surveys, 12 of the 16 rare plants that we documented occur in groundwater dependent ecosystems. They're dependent on groundwater. And also 30% of the vegetation area that we mapped are dominated by wetland plants. So it's clear that groundwater and any alteration to the hydrology are very significant threats to the biodiversity in this region. And so one of the difficulties, the Amargosa Wild and Scenic River occurs entirely in California, but much of the groundwater extraction that is happening, or the groundwater extraction is happening in Nevada. So there is work that needs to be done thinking about managing groundwater across state lines. So next, I'm going to move into talking about some specific rare plant studies. But before I do that, I kind of want to give you a flavor or an understanding of just how many rare plants occur in this region. So these are just plants that are endemic or near endemic and very closely associated with the actual Amargosa River. If I were to broaden it out to the groundwatershed and all the adjacent mountains, this list would grow. But here we have 12 kinds of plants, and 7 of them are listed under the Endangered Species Act as being endangered or threatened. And the majority of those 7 plants, in fact, all those 7 plants occur in Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge. Some of them occur outside the refuge as well, but all of them occur in the refuge. So it's just really, this is a place, if you are interested in rare plants and want to see a lot of rare plants in one place, I highly recommend a trip to Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge because there's so many. A couple of the rare plants on this list I have pictured here. This is a sweet plant. I really love this plant. I know it looks rather humble, but this is the Pahrump Orange, and it lives in Pahrump Valley, Stewart Valley, Chicago Valley, I think California Valley as well. And that's the extent of its entire range, is these few valleys in and around the Amargosa River. And then we have the Ash Meadows Blazing Star, which I think is one of the rarer, more plants of more limited distribution that is restricted to the Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, with a couple of populations just outside the refuge on BLM land. So unfortunately, there are many threats to the rare plants of the Amargosa, and they share all those plants I listed, share many of these threats, including, as I mentioned before, and I probably, maybe I'll sound like a broken record, but groundwater extraction or overdraft is really such a significant threat for the biodiversity in the region. We have also water diversion and management of springs could impact rare plant populations. Of course, climate change and increasing drought and temperatures could have an impact, especially in increasing evapotranspiration in wetlands. Off-highway vehicles, definitely in certain habitats, they're vulnerable to off-highway vehicle incursion. There are mining claims in and around some of these habitats, especially up near Death Valley Junction area. And then we also have animals that could cause disturbance at some of these habitats, namely primarily wild horses. I haven't seen the burro so much specifically in some of these habitats. So then, I don't know, this might be like, this is like, to me, like the all-star rare plant, like very cool plant that I spent a lot of time with this plant. So maybe that's why I feel like it's the all-star. This is the Amargosa nidowort, Nitrophyllum Javensis. It's a succulent in a family called Amaranthaceae. So that is the same family that has quinoa in it. It has these really cute little pink flowers. We don't really know what pollinates it, but it grows very low to the ground. Maybe it's only 2 inches off the ground, and it lives on these mud flats at Lower Carson Slough. It's federally listed by as endangered, but it's also listed by the state of California and Nevada also as endangered. So we have been conducting research on the Amargosa nidowort, and there's a number of things we want to know, but we're wanting to understand its population trends. So how are populations increasing or decreasing, and what's causing an increase or a decrease in population trends? We're trying to learn more about its pollination biology and really trying to figure out, when does this plant produce seed? How much seed can it produce? We've yet to see, like, it doesn't like to produce a lot of seed, we've learned. We're also documenting threats to this plant so we can help or provide recommendations for management to improve its habitat and identify priority management actions that can be implemented to conserve the plant. So we do monitoring every year in July. We get up at, 4 a.m., 3 a.m., whatever time we need to get on the road at 4:30 to get to Carson Slough at 5 a.m. so we can beat the heat. And we survey these transects. So this is State Line Road. And we just have several transects that are permanently marked, laid out where we do our monitoring. We also have 5 smaller plots that are called growth plots laid out in that area where and the Amargosa Conservancy actually did a lot of this work as well, where we measured plants every month for multiple years. We have our data set maybe is something like 5 or 6 years worth of data on how the plant grows every month. And we learned some really important things by looking at this data. We learned that the plant starts to germinate, or starts to emerge from the ground around February. It's growing great in March, April, May, June, July. In August, it starts to yellow a bit, and then it's starting to kind of die. The above ground material is dying, but the plant is still very much alive underground. And then eventually by December, January, it goes totally dormant and just lives as an underground rhizome. And so that's the life cycle of the plant. It's perennial, and they come up every year and then they die back to the ground. So it's very interesting life cycle, very fun to watch the nidowort in all months of the year. And we count nidowort plants. We lay out these transects and we just go and we count plants and we measure plants. It takes over a week of multiple teams doing this work. One of the things that we found that I think is really interesting is that the abundance of nidowort actually changes quite dramatically year to year. So everywhere you see an asterisk means that this is statistically significant change a significant increase from 2015 to 2016, and then 2016 to 2017, but then in 2017 to 2018, we have a significant decrease. So we looked at this as to see if it correlated with different climate factors. And based on the climate factors we looked at, we didn't see a specific correlation, but we might also just need more data. It's something I want to look at some more, because I do think lack of precipitation impacts the plant. We did our monitoring in 2022, and I think we'll either see similar numbers to 2021 or a decline. I haven't added those up yet, but it was not a great year for the nightwort this year. But we have dedicated teams of people counting nightworts every year so we can understand the trends. And when we look at just where the nightwort lives in general, there's lots of populations in and around Ash Meadows. This is the population I monitor in and around Carson Slough, and then we have some plants in Tecopa. The California population in Carson Slough is actually the largest, most abundant population of nightwort in the world. It's the best population, not just because it's the one I monitor, but it's just the biggest and very healthy population. And so that's a good reason to be tracking that population. So I showed you the area where we monitor. So that's these blue squares here, but we know there's a lot of nightwort that exists outside of those permanently marked plots. And we wanted to learn more about the extent of the nightwort and where it grows and its abundance. So we implemented, excuse me, a grid. And we did this huge survey this year to try to count nightworts across its whole habitat. And I think we were fairly successful, but this is just to give you an idea of like the kind of data we collected. And we looked at nightwort up and down the slough, and we counted lots of nightworts in many, many squares. And you can see the nightwort. So the darker the square, the more nightwort there are. And there's a lot more nightwort here than there is closer to the road. And so this might help us track trends in a different way than looking at abundance just in the transects. We also did this work in Tecopa. And as a part of our surveys in Tecopa, we actually documented 3 new occurrences that hadn't been previously documented. So that was really exciting. And so I've been feeling like the plants in Tecopa aren't doing very well, but it was really nice to find additional plants there. So some of the things we've learned about the nightwort is that we need to learn more about its reproductive biology, because we still don't fully understand its pollination, and we don't understand why it doesn't make a lot of seed. But one of the things we also learned is that there are far fewer plants south of the road than there are north of the road. And one of the explanations I can think of is that the road actually sits up high and might be creating a berm and impeding water flow. So the water is kind of being held up against the road and not getting to the other side of the road. So this is something I've talked about with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we have a nightwort working group with BLM and other members. And I'm hoping that maybe there could be some infrastructure change along the road to allow water to better pass through, but that probably is going to take a lot of work, but it's a recommendation we have. There's a fence to protect the nightwort from off-highway vehicle incursion. So we constantly monitor that fence and can report back to BLM if the fence needs to be repaired. And then the Amargosa Conservancy actually does work too. There's several piezometers out on the slough to monitor the groundwater levels. And that's something that should continue so we can understand how groundwater might be changing and potentially impacting this species. So now we'll move on to the Tecopa Birdspeak, which is a very beautiful annual. It's in a plant family called Orobanchaceae. It's the broomrape family, and they are parasites. They're partially parasitic, and usually their little roots are attached to grasses, and they get some of their nutrients that way. So the genus Chloropyron is commonly known as salty birdspeak. This is Tecopa birdspeak cousin, the salt marsh birdspeak. There are only 4 species of Chloropyron in the world. And within those 4 species, there's several subspecies. All of them are annuals, and they're all, the whole genus, all the species in the genus are restricted to alkaline wetlands. Many of them occur in coastal salt marshes, but 3 of the species occur in inland alkali wetlands, including the Tecopa birdspeak. And several of them are federally listed as endangered or threatened, but the Tecopa birdspeak doesn't have listing status currently. So like I mentioned earlier, we saw the herbarium specimen of the Tecopa birdspeak. It was first collected in 1949 by a fellow named John C. Roos. So John Roos wasn't a formally trained botanist, but he was a physician who lived in Loma Linda. He was a Seventh-day Adventist who loved to frequent the hot springs in Tecopa. And while he was there vacationing, he would check out the plants, and he found all kinds of interesting plants like the Tecopa birdspeak and the nidowort. And he brought them back to Philip Munns, who was working at the California Botanic Garden, and they described them together, both around 1950. The Tecopa birdspeak was historically thought to be restricted and only live in the Amargosa River. But in 1978, Margaret Williams and Jim Reveal, who are 2 exceptional botanists of Nevada, they found it in Fish Lake Valley in Esmeralda County, Nevada. And so that's a gap of 200 miles to the north, a whole new location for the Tecopa birdspeak. And so that kind of like will lead into the questions I'm asking about the Tecopa birdspeak. Like I said, it's a hemiparasite, so that means it's partially parasitic, and its potential host plants are saltgrass and alkali sakatan, which are 2 different kinds of perennial grasses that occur in alkali wetlands. So this is the distribution of the Tecopa birdspeak. These are the populations up in that are 200 miles to the north, and then these are all the Amargosa River populations here to the south. And it's interesting to note that each population center has a different, occurs at a different elevation. So the Fish Lake Valley populations occur at 4,600 feet elevation. It's a bit colder there, shorter growing season. The populations in and around Ash Meadows and Carson Slough are at 2,400 feet. These are the populations around Shoshone and Tecopa at 1,300 feet. And then they also grow at Saratoga Spring all the way down at 200 feet elevation. I'm actually hoping to visit the Saratoga Spring population in the next week or so. And those are the hottest, it's the hottest, driest location probably for the Tecopa birdspeak. And it actually hasn't been relocated there since 1950. So I'm really hoping to find it and hope that it's still there, but there's been no confirmation that it's still growing there since 1950. Maybe there was a report, I think in the 70s, and there was a search for it in the 80s and 90s, and it was not relocated. So this is the habitat of the Tecopa birdspeak. This is the wetland between Shoshone and Tecopa. You can see this is the Tonopah Tidewater Railroad over here. And this is the grass, the alkali sakatan. And here is the Tecopa birdspeak, all this patch up in here. These are very healthy looking plants. And there's all different kinds of alkali wetland species that are associated with the Tecopa birdspeak. It's a very rich, lush habitat, beautiful alkali wetland where it grows. And this is what the habitat looks like up in Gap Spring, Fish Lake Valley, Esmeralda County, Nevada. There's actually a lot fewer plants that co-occur with the Tecopa birdspeak here. Here in this specific habitat, there was saltgrass and Baltic rush and arrowweed. So it wasn't as rich, but there's some other areas where the Tecopa birdspeak grows in Fish Lake Valley that have other wetland plants. So similarly to all the other rare plants, hydrological alteration, groundwater overdraft, water diversion, these are all threats to the Tecopa birdspeak. There's also issues with off-highway vehicle incursion, especially in and around the wetland between Shoshone and Tecopa. Sometimes there's off-highway vehicle incursion there. And then trampling from horses. And then there's a lot of mining prospects in Fish Lake Valley and potentially out near Carson Slough as well. So mining, lithium mining, and geothermal is actually other potential threats to this species. So the current study, this is active research that's happening right now, would be to examine the differences between the Amargosa River population and the Fish Lake Valley population. So one of the things that's really interesting about botanical work is that taxonomy as a science is alive and well, and there's still a lot to be learned about how species should be partitioned and whether or not we should recognize new subspecies or new species. And that research is very active in California. So in looking at the Fish Lake Valley populations, I did notice some initial differences. The plants looked a lot more diminutive, and I was just curious if that might be significant. The habitats are a little bit different, and it certainly occurs at much higher elevation. So I did a lot of field work and I looked at the herbarium record as well and looked at herbarium specimens. And I sampled plants from 3 populations in the Amargosa River. So Carson Slough, Shoshone, and Tecopa area. And then 3 populations in Fish Lake Valley as well. And I gathered various kinds of data and made lots of measurements. And this is what I found. One of the things I found is that the plants in the Amargosa River, so the purple blobs, the plants are taller and wider. They're generally much larger plants than you find in Fish Lake Valley. And this was statistically significant when I did a 2-sample t-test. And so they're statistically significant that they are sort of have different size. I also looked at their bloom time and found that the plants in the Amargosa River have a much extended blooming period. And this makes sense just based on the growing period. So it stays warmer for longer in the Amargosa River, and they bloom from June to all the way till November. You can see that, remember the specimens from Philip Munns, they were collected in October. And in Fish Lake Valley, the plants there go dormant by September. They're done. It gets too cold there. So they have a much compressed bloom period, but they also start blooming earlier. And so one could hypothesize or think that maybe the plants are smaller in Fish Lake Valley just because they have this compressed growing period. So one of the questions I want to address is if there's a genetic component to this, and if so I want to conduct a genetic study to see if there's distinct differences that get picked up in the genetic data between these 2 population areas. So this is just a summary of some of the differences between the Amargosa River and the Fish Lake Valley populations. And so this research is ongoing. I'm hoping to get a genetic study, some funding for a genetic study. And one of my graduate students, her name is Perry Lee, and they're studying the flora of the Silver Peak Range out near Fish Lake Valley. They're going to be doing a project this fall for one of their classes where they look more in detail at the morphological differences, that like looking at flowers under the scanning electron microscope to see if we could pick up even more minute differences between the 2. So to summarize, the Amargosa and Fish Lake Valley populations, they are different in many ways. They're ecologically different. The plants in the Amargosa River are larger. So they are distinct populations, and they also have different conservation considerations because there are different threats up in Fish Lake Valley than there are in the Amargosa River area. So one would suggest that perhaps these populations should be managed as distinct units to advance their conservation. So the current working hypothesis is that perhaps the Fish Lake Valley populations might warrant distinction as a different subspecies, but I'm hoping to gather the genetic data. I wouldn't make that call until I gather some genetic data. So we'll see what that might yield. So we're doing future research. We're going to look at plants under the scanning electron microscope. We're going to do a population genomic study, and we'll see what we find. So maybe I'll report those in a future Amargosa Conservancy newsletter. So as I tie this up, I just, we've looked at all these incredible alkali wetland ecosystems and all the rare plants associated with them. A lot of scientific papers have identified groundwater dependent ecosystems as important refugia to support biodiversity in our changing climate. They are reservoirs for biodiversity. But these systems are not immune from climate change. They perhaps it's thought that the extreme effects of climate change might be ameliorated in these areas that have ancient groundwater to rely on. But increasing heat and temperatures definitely increases evapotranspiration and definitely seeing the impacts of drought on a lot of these ecosystems. So hopefully, these ecosystems will support biodiversity well into the future, but definitely in order to do that, we have to protect the groundwater. The groundwater is so essential for the species persistence well into the future. And without that, we would lose all this incredible biodiversity. So protection of the groundwater is absolutely essential. And that's one of the reasons I work with the Amargosa Conservancy. And I'm so passionate about the work that we do because we stand for the water, and the water is everything in the Amargosa. And so we want to see sustainable groundwater usage, and we want to see the springs continue to flow. Because when the springs dry up, all the pupfish, all the spring snails, all the rare plants, they won't be able to be supported any longer. And it's just, I'm just so grateful that I get to do work in this incredible region and learn and be able to share about the wonderful rare plants that live here. So that I want to thank you all for coming. You can feel free to email me if you have follow-up questions. And I do want to thank the Bureau of Land Management, who has supported a lot of our projects. And Susan Sorrells in Shoshone has also supported our work as well. Our Amargosa Wild and Scenic River surveys, Brian Brown supported us a lot in that work at China Ranch. And the Center for Biological Diversity is also a great partner that we work with as well. So thank you so much. And if anyone has any questions, I am happy to answer.
Wow, awesome. Thank you so much, Naomi. This was just really enjoyable for me. I hope it was for everyone as well. It's just really been great to get to walk around with Naomi out in these areas. You just kind of can't help but catch this infectious enthusiasm for how cool and special these plants are. And as she said, we're just so lucky that we have this relationship where we can fight the good fight together and make sure that these plants have a sustainable future. So let's dive into some questions here, if you don't mind, Naomi. There's some really good ones. The first one is a question around the last super bloom, that there was a concern about the bloom being out of sync with pollinators. And this person's just wondering, is there anyone who's monitoring the insects in concert with the plants in this region?
That's a really good question. The last super bloom, the significant rains took place, I believe, in October 2015. And then we had a pretty early bloom in 2016. I don't know anyone specifically who's tracking the pollinators. That's something that always needs to be researched more in depth, is the plant pollinator relationship. I mean, insects are really understudied. They lack protections that other organisms, they're just these tiny things that people don't give. They're not first and foremost in most people's minds, but that's something that's really important that needs to be monitored. But I don't know of anyone actively doing that.
Yeah, and if anyone knows, throw it in the chat if you're aware of someone actually doing that work. That'd be very interesting. The next question we have is around how well the Nevada side of the Amargosa Basin flora is documented compared to the California side.
So I would say so Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, because it's so special, probably has a little bit more documentation than other areas in Nevada, although I don't know how much of that documentation is recent. And also preserved in the herbarium record. There's probably a lot more work to really dig in and document the flora that could be done. But overall, unfortunately, Nevada is a little bit of a black hole in botanical knowledge in terms of like formal botanical documentation. There's actually a paper published that shows that, Nevada has very few herbarium specimens overall. And so I'm encouraging, so I have a student now doing a floristic study in Nevada. She's working in the Silver Peak Range in Esmeralda County, Nevada. And I have a lot of students working with me to do this botanical work and documentation. And I'm definitely encouraging them to go across state lines because we need more botanical work in Nevada. California, for some reason, has attracted numerous botanists over the years, but the Amargosa overall, the whole region needs better documentation.
Awesome, thank you. We have a question here, which is a good one. Let's talk about why do we have such a problem managing and taking out tamarisk in the desert Southwest?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult because it spreads so widely. And I mean, when you have a very thick infestation as you do in the Amargosa River Canyon, it would have very big ecological effects to remove all of that, even if you could. And it would just be so expensive and take so much manpower that, I mean, it would just really alter the system in a way, because all those trees are providing canopy cover, shade, it is providing habitat for birds. And if you were to remove that all right away, or even if you could, it's such an aggressive spreader, it would really have significant impacts. So there's just a lot of considerations when thinking about how one would approach tamarisk removal, because you don't want to impact wildlife. But it's really hard to think about. I thought about it a lot as I did many hikes through the Amargosa River Canyon, is what would tamarisk removal even look like? What could happen really to get it under control? Because it is so dense and thick in many areas. It's a very difficult question, and also a difficult one for land managers because it's so resource intensive.
Yeah, actually, there's a related question in the chat that I just picked up on. Are there talks about any kind of like biocontrol releases to help take out the species or manage it?
There is a beetle, a tamarisk beetle, but I don't really know the latest update of that, but I don't believe, some have advocated it for its release into the Amargosa River Canyon. I personally don't advocate for that because I think it could have devastating effects for some of the birds, but I don't know. I mean, I'm definitely not a fan of tamarisk. I would like to see the tamarisk gone, and I'd love to see restoration back to whatever might have been around sometime before, but that it's just to even know what that was, because there's areas where there's increase in mesquite density. There's just a lot of change that has happened in certain areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, we're still learning so much about this system, and it's hard to know what a biocontrol would actually, what the impacts would be. This next question is about a specific species. Maybe you can talk about, the question is, can the Imperata be seeded by Willow Creek around China Ranch? Or where would we find that particular species?
So the Imperata was found in a seep, and there's these sort of hanging gardens or seeps along canyon walls in the Amargosa River Canyon. And a lot of those support California sawgrass and other interesting plants. And that's where we found the Imperata in one specific patch on a seep. So if it were habitats similar to that in and around Willow Creek or China Ranch, I think it could be established. It needs more open areas, so it could easily be crowded out by a dense canopy. So someplace where it's more open.
Fantastic. I'm going to group a couple of questions together because there's a pattern here. So do you have any just favorite recommendations for accessible books for people without a lot of botany experience, or other resources for just learning more about plants of the Mojave Desert? And I'll just combine a question of, is there an ethnobotany publication for this area that would be accessible?
So for books, I would recommend a book from my friends, Pam McKay and Tim Thomas, who wrote a book on Mojave Desert wildflowers. It is, I think, the best book on Mojave Desert wildflowers. It won't give you the talk I gave today about these obscure plants, rarities in the Amargosa. It won't contain any of those, but it will tell you the most common plants that you're going to come across the Mojave Desert. And in terms of an ethnobotanical reference, there are many. I don't know of a specific one on hand, unfortunately, but there's some of them. might refer more, to like a lot of them are for foraging kind of broadly in North America. Some of them have a wider geographic scope and aren't, say, specific to this area. But, mesquite was a very important food plant. And that's, there's a book called Eat Mesquite, which I highly recommend.
Awesome. And just a note here, in the Q&A, we have a fan request for some kind of pamphlet on native plants and noxious weeds that we could take out while hiking. Sounds like there's a lot of popular interest in that. So something maybe we should consider developing. Yeah,
it's something we should definitely work on.
There's another question that came in here about, so any idea approximately how long the Nitrophylla and the Chloropyron on the Amargosa have been isolated from those at the other locations? Yeah.
That is such a good question. And that is a question I would love to answer. But so if I'm able to move forward with the population genomic study, I might be able to get some dates for when those populations became separated, but I don't have that yet. On the Amargosa nightwort, very interestingly, one of its closest relatives lives in the Atacama Desert in South America. And so they've been separated for a very long time. And the current hypothesis is that through long distance dispersal, maybe on a bird's foot or something, a seed from the Atacama Desert made its way to North America, and the seeds were planted for the future of the Amargosa nightwort. So it's a long distance dispersal event. It came all the way across from South to North America. A lot of birds make that migration route, and there's lots of instances. So they call it amphitropical disjunction occurring on both sides of the tropics, North and South America, and on a bird migration route. So I don't know how many tens of thousands of years that was, but it was a long time ago, and it's been living out its little quiet life in the Mojave Desert since then.
That's pretty incredible. There's a question that we have around would you expect differences in soil chemistry between these locales? Have there been soil studies done on where the species are located?
And that's one of the pieces of data I actually really want to gather. I want to look at soil pH, salinity, and soil moisture to see if there's differences between the two areas. But I don't have those data yet. I need to get special instrumentation in order to gather those data.
Great. And then there's a question here just specifically about the nightwort. Does this species have that ability to kind of go dormant for prolonged periods, like multi-year periods when it's under environmental stress?
That is a good question. There are, so, I noted that there's fluctuations in the number of plants we observe year to year. And so I do think that is what's happening, is that some of the rhizomes are just laying low in a year of drought, and they're hanging out. They're like, maybe they shoot up a little shoot for a month and then they die back to the ground. They get a little photosynthesis, little sugars sent to the rhizome, and then they die back. And we don't catch those in our monitoring. So yes, I think that sometimes conditions are too harsh and they're just gonna lay low under the ground until conditions are better.
Excellent. This is a fun question. We're very lucky to have you and several board members that are very good plant photographers, and especially it's hard to get the scale of how small some of these plants are. So what are your best photography tips for field botanists?
Sometimes you just have to really be patient and try not to breathe too hard, because you might move the plant. So stillness, patience, and then I think just trying different settings on your camera. A lot of the photographs that I showed, I use different cameras. I have a digital SLR camera that some of the pictures came from, but I also use my camera phone, on my iPhone a lot. And you can get really great photos usually using a cell phone if you just kind of practice with the settings.
Yeah, absolutely. I when I go out and try to get a photo, I spend just a lot of time laying on my stomach on these places, trying to get the right light and everything. And it's definitely possible, but it certainly does take some patience and practice. So it's great. We just have one kind of follow-up question on a previous point, which was the soil. Is there can you just say more about the instrumentation that would be required to do that testing?
Yeah, there are certain instruments where you can take, it'll log data on soil moisture, pH, and so forth that they have are probes essentially you would stick into the ground. And you can, one of the things I'd like to do, say for the nidawort, is to look at different depths and to see how soil moisture changes at different depths. But yeah, there's little like probes that can gather that sort of data that you'd stick down into the soil.
Yeah, it'd be very, very interesting to find that out in some of these areas. Well, that is, actually one question, actually a good question that came into the chat here, which is how does the salt actually build up on the surfaces in these places?
Yeah, it's through evaporation. So you have a lot of these soils are saturated. They're constantly wet with water. So you have constant evaporation happening, and you have a lot of minerals, and you have alkaline water and lots of different salts. And so you just get evaporation happening and the salts stay behind, and it just get a buildup of salt crust on the surface of the soil.
Yeah, and I can tell you that the sun definitely reflects pretty strong off that surface when you're walking around out there.
Yes.
And just, I think we're caught up on our questions. There's a final point in the Q&A just saying, be careful. And I can say it's Naomi's work in the field is such a labor of love to do this year round. And in this environment that is, is quite harsh and can be quite foreboding. So I can just say on behalf of everyone, we appreciate your dedication to the work and braving those conditions and finding out this information, which is extremely valuable for our work and hopefully will be for future generations. So with that, I just want to thank everyone again for coming out tonight. This was really, really fun. Thanks again, Naomi, for sharing all this knowledge with us. As I said, this has been recorded. We're going to share this out tomorrow, and I'll be sure to include those recommendations that Naomi suggested as far as books and resources for learning more about this. But in the meantime, like I said, check out the Amargosa Conservancy's website. We have all kinds of fantastic information on this and related topics. Thank everyone again, and we hopefully will see you August 24th for our geology presentation. All right. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.